Good evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 62 of SCOTONOMICS. Thanks to everyone, especially those people who have been with us from the start, and everyone who's watching us on Twitter, YouTube, and also on Facebook, excuse me. We've got a brilliant episode this evening talking about how you create a new state. It's a fantastic interview with Professor Qvortrup, and we're going to cover that after Karen and I have had a little bit of a conversation before. So I'm going to welcome her. Karen still looks like she's still in the office, but I'll bring you on now. Hi, Karen. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, I'm in a community council meeting, so I'm nipping out in between to just do the intro.
Brilliant, brilliant. Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. Well, I wanted to bring to everyone's attention and your attention, because it just came out today, a really fascinating report by the BBC. And I think the BBC can justifiably be criticised quite a lot in certain areas. And one area I've always thought was particularly weak was its coverage of the economy. So I wasn't aware this review was going on, but there has been a review of the impartiality of BBC coverage of taxation, public spending, government borrowing, and debt. So very specific and a lot around the areas that we cover. I'm going to put a link to it. I'll just put this actually. I'll put the link into the chat now. Really recommend that everyone has a look at this. It's fascinating and it's really honest, the report. And I've done a little thread on our SCOTONOMICS Twitter, so please do have a look. And I think it's so important and so interesting. I'll probably write a little blog post as well. But Karen, I'll read it to you and I'll read a few for the audience as well. It looked at impartiality on many levels, not just political, but covering a wide range of views. It found that any mistakes, biases were likely journalistic ones rather than political ones, but they highlight that this is still a problem. We think that too many journalists lack understanding of basic economics or lack confidence reporting it. One fix for the BBC, and this is what I've written, one fix for the BBC would be stop asking political correspondents economic questions. And that's something you and I have highlighted before. It would be really good if they were able to say, I'm not really able to cover the economics in depth. Let's go over to our economic correspondent. So that came out really, really strongly. I just said that you can see the political correspondents flapping about. Anyone who's watching now, let us know if you've heard of this review and if you're interested about it and if you're going to have a look at it, because I thought it was fascinating. It continues, there are general assumptions that plague the coverage. Their examples are public spending is good and tax cuts are good. They suggest that trade-offs could be more explicitly acknowledged. This again leads to a deeper call for economics by commentators. BBC journalists should exercise extreme caution before suggesting a government will, in commas, will have to, for example, raise taxes, cut spending, raise spending, cut debt, raise debt. So that's really important. Too often, they've said, it's not clear from a report that fiscal policy decisions are also political choices.
Yeah.
So I'll read that again. All too often, it's not clear that fiscal policy decisions are also political choices. They're not inevitable. It's just that governments like to present them that way. And I've put, if coverage presents choices like austerity, not funding the NHS as a choice, then these things are really significant. It continues, the tax-paying interest of people on low incomes and whole areas of the UK where incomes tend to be low are a striking example of neglect within the economic coverage. This is admitting there's a massive Westminster bubble. And I really like this point. Economics can be uncertain. The one reason is it means choices. We're not sure the extent of this uncertainty is always appreciated or reported. And I think that's really important because too often we've got an economist on the BBC and many of the news outlets, and they're saying something and it's just taken as read. And the commentator doesn't say, that's a very valid opinion, but there are other opinions we're going to hear from another economist taking an opposite view. Yeah. So that's a really, really positive thing. Any thoughts so far on that? I've got a couple more.
Yeah, that's great. That sounds great.
Yeah. And one really interesting point I think you'll like, let me see if I can find this. It said that overall, let me see if I can find it. In our audience research, most had no comment about impartiality on fiscal policy because they didn't know what the stories meant. Scottish audiences felt a little more informed. Now, you and I cannot take full credit for that. But it's really good to see, and I would point back to the independence referendum as being one of the reasons that Scottish audiences are much more aware what fiscal policy is and what economics are. So it's really fascinating. I really do recommend everyone has a look at it. And it also leads nicely into what Matt's talking about, because so much of what he says is opinion and evidence-based from what he's read. And I've written a really detailed blog looking at the economics chapter to say, yes, everything he said, there's elements of truth, but there is a different perspective to this as well. So I think it's really nice if you kind of package this together, that it would be great if you had the BBC looking at alternative voices for the commentary and also explaining things in a bit more detail. So hopefully this report's going to have some traction. But, you know, as I said at the start, all too often we criticise the BBC. I think this is a really forward-thinking, positive move to have had this review on something so specific and so important as around fiscal policy and debt.
Yeah, and I think it's especially important as well, seeing as how University of Glasgow pointed out that 330,000 people have died because of austerity measures. That's not because of the pandemic, that's because of austerity. So people need to know what they're signing up for when they agree to austerity and what that can mean.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really important point there, it is not inevitable, it's a political choice. And I think that could have huge ramifications for the BBC if they do start looking at things much more on the choices that governments have rather than inevitability. They also told off a lot of journalists for saying things like eye-watering debt and things like since records began. And they've got a wonderful section that shows you just one chart, and it says there were so many different ways to present government debt, but the way that BBC presented it was that there was a huge issue with this and it had to be reduced. So really, really thoughtful, really interesting report. So much so, I'm going to read it again. Okay, right. We're now going to move on to Matt's interview we had with him just a couple of weeks ago. It's a full 40 minutes. It's really fantastic. We didn't go into the economics that much because I thought all the other things you were talking about were equally important when you're considering starting up a new country. But we did cover economics as well. I hope you enjoy the interview, and I'm going to put up the link to my blog post about halfway through, and you can have an alternative view. Kieran and the audience, I hope you enjoy this. Kieran, will I be able to speak to you after it?
I won't be available after, but I'd just like to say to the audience, I thought it was very interesting what Matt said about culture. But watch out for that when it comes.
Great, thanks so much. Well, I won't join you either at the end because you've probably had enough of me. Enjoy the interview, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Matt, welcome to SCOTONOMICS.
It's an honour and a pleasure.
So ever dreamed of starting your own country or want to understand how? Matt's latest book, I Want to Break Free, A Practical Guide to Making a New Country, is essential reading. Matt Qvortrup is Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Coventry University, Editor-in-Chief of the Q1 journal European Political Science Review, and expert in referendums, European politics and comparative government. I Want to Break Free, A Practical Guide to Making a New Country came out last year and was widely acknowledged as adding considerably to the debate and the discussion in Scotland and many other countries around the challenges and opportunities of creating a new state. Now, there's 6 sections in the book. The last one is entitled Shake Your Moneymaker, the economics of becoming a new country. And being an economic podcast, that's what we want to cover in detail today. But before we get to the economics, I'd like to ask you, can you give us a brief summary of the first part of the book, which is the history of self-determination and the making of a new state?
Yes, and I think it's very important that it's one of the quotes that I have in the book, that nationalism was an ideology created in the 19th century. So new states, the creation of new states really is sort of a 19th century phenomenon. There are lots of places that we now take for granted as having existed forever, really, like Italy. But Italy was not a state until, 1870. Germany wasn't really a state. It was an amalgam of tiny little sort of princelings getting together. So Germany didn't really exist. And of course, places like Norway and Finland were only just established in the last century. So the history of the past, if you like, 200 years has been basically the history of countries realizing that they actually were different from other people as in typically the empires of which they were part. So some people might argue that Scotland might be a bit of a latecomer to that, but so it was very much that was sort of very much the story of it. But it's also, when you look at the past 200 years, and now I know I sound like an academic, and that is my job. A lot of the culture that we got from those 200 years is also, in many ways, was propaganda to create new states. So people who are sort of a bit highbrow and go to the opera might listen to Verdi and Wagner and so on, and music by Sibelius in Finland and Grieg in Norway. Some of the most important composers and in the past, well, certainly in the 19th century, were all really just people who were providing literally the mood music for movements that led to independence.
It's interesting. It's interesting you mentioned culture there, because that's hugely important in the creation of a new state, and the culture that's underpinning a new state, and also the cultural kind of awareness that the creation of a new state seems to create. Is that something that you covered in the book?
Yes, that's very much part of what I do, and of course, it's not just sort of high culture. Some people will be aware of the Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote The Social Contract and many other things, but he was also moonlighting as a political consultant to the Polish government in the 1770s. And he said to the Polish, the only way in which you can become independent of either the Germans or the Russians, or the Prussians, it was in those days, not the Russians really, and not the Germans. The only way you can do that is to create this sort of momentum. And he actually, rather interestingly, promoted the idea of sport as a thing that people can rally around. And he has this famous line, "There would be no Spain without bullfighting." I know you live in Catalonia, where they say that they don't want bullfighting because that's torturous and terrible, and a thing that the Castilians do. So some of these things that may not really seem very important to sort of very intellectual types actually are things that people can rally around. So whether it's sort of popular culture like sport, or whether it's sort of the sort of more highbrow type of culture like operas and classical music, all of those things are part of creating a movement. And if you want to create an independent country, you need to do that. I was recently in touch with, as part of the promotion for the book, some people in Texas who wanted to create a Texit movement, no less, and they wanted to create Texas as an independent country. Now, I think the chances of that are pretty slim, to be honest. But interestingly, they cited country music and Willie Nelson and so on as one of the reasons why they shouldn't be part of the United States. And while I may not be entirely sure that they're going to achieve that goal, it's interesting they start from that particular perspective. Well, I think sometimes the cultural flourishing is before and after, actually. I mean, if you take the example of Norway, there are many Norwegians who think that Ibsen is a greater playwright than Shakespeare. And if you start to argue with a Norwegian, they will be very shocked that some people have thought that Shakespeare was that. But of course, somebody like Ibsen was living around the time when Norway became independent, and you need to then sort of reinforce that you have that uniqueness, and it's probably a thing that sort of spurs on a lot of literature, a lot of culture. And that certainly was the case in Finland. It's been the case in Norway, and it's also to a degree been the case in Italy. Italy was pioneers in making films, and that was sort of led to the new media, led itself to the cultural flourish afterwards. Now, Italy, of course, had a bit of a relapse when they had Mussolini and so on a little bit later. But in the sort of first years after independence, there was certainly a growth of that. So, but it's both before and after. Like people in Scotland will be aware of the Faroe Islands, and the Faroe Islands up to the left of Shetland, and the Faroe Islands actually had a referendum on independence from Denmark in 1946, and then the Danes didn't recognize that, and it's a bit of a long story that I mentioned in some of my writings. But Finland, interestingly, has the highest number of published poets per population, only surpassed by Iceland. Iceland, another country that was created as recently as 1944, and Iceland has had more published authors than any other country in the world, and some of them I think they've also got more Nobel Prize winners in literature than per population than any other country. So these things are very important and can lead to many of these things. Whether it is popular culture or not is not always. South Sudan has had a number of problems, but they also now are trying to make up for that on the basketball courts. So you can have, but it leads to. It releases energy for countries that are new rather than create all this energy.
Yeah, we've spoken to a few economists. Stephen Kinsella, who's an economics professor in Ireland, and he says that the Irish independence was driven much more by culture and innovation than it was by economics, and that it's really easy to look at a country and think you're going to do X, Y in terms of finance or growth. But what's immeasurable but has a huge impact is these other areas like culture, the flourishing and the understanding of one's own history. And we think that's fascinating when we're looking at the development of a country, that there's those other aspects that are really difficult to measure. So when you were looking at the country's newly developed states, and I think there was around about 20 new states in Europe in the 1990s. What were the elements of success, and what were the challenges that those countries had?
Well, I think if I just sort of go back to you say it's difficult to measure, but I think it's not difficult to analyze using economic theory, really. You'd be aware of sort of inelastic goods and elastic goods. And there are certain goods that if the price changes, then you say, well, it's not really for me, and I'm happy to give up on that. But there are other things that are sort of literally immeasurable, literally, they're literally priceless. And becoming the reason why culture is so important is that it makes the good, the public good of or the private good of independence virtually priceless. So if you ask people, would you rather have cheaper beer or cheaper alcohol or cheaper petrol or whatever, then it's a trade-off, and you might change onto another sort of substitution good. But when you're talking about freedom, then freedom is a thing that no matter the price of this particular thing, you really, it's such a thing that you're willing to pay an extraordinary amount for. So I think actually economic theory really lends itself to explaining why these sort of emotional things can be so important. So a little bit of sort of public choice theory can go a long way in explaining independence.
Another chapter you have is around the legal side of creating a new state, and that's obviously crucially important for Scotland. So let's look at Scotland specifically then. Where does Scotland go from now, considering the legal barriers and challenges that we have at the moment to become, or at least have a meaningful decision on whether or not Scotland wants to become independent?
Well, I think the longer the London government, you might say the English government really, waits, the longer they say, frankly ignore Scotland, the more momentum there will be, the more anger there will be, and eventually there will be a referendum. So if you were to have a referendum now, it would probably be lost, and in some ways maybe that would mean curtains for an independence move. That's what happened in Quebec, where they had the second referendum, and after that it became a no issue. Now, if you don't, eventually there will probably be enough political pressure for a referendum to take place. Now, sort of the constitutional argument, as purists are presenting it, and as the Supreme Court has done it, the Supreme Court can't, their hands are tied, they can't really help it. It is a reserved matter, and therefore Scotland can't itself hold a referendum. But if you look at other places where they've had referendums and the time frame for that, Malta, for example, was promised to have MPs, send 3 MPs to Parliament in 1955. They were promised all sorts of things in 1955. They just were never delivered. And there in 1964, so 9 years later, there was a referendum on leaving. So they voted 1955 to stay part of Britain, or part of the UK even, which a lot of people are not aware of. And then 9 years later, they just basically had enough and voted with a relatively narrow majority for independence. And I think a similar scenario is not unlikely in the case of Scotland, if the right, if you like, or the opportunity to vote in a referendum is denied to the Scottish people. I think the other thing that is rarely talked about is sort of the international law of independence movements. And the international law is a thing called the Estrada Doctrine. It's a former Mexican foreign minister who basically sort of came up with what is the international principles of when you have a state. And that has to have a defined territory, a defined population. You have to have a government that's able to provide the services and perform the tasks of a state, have courts, have a police force, and so on. And then that particular state can't be a puppet state. And in many ways, Scotland would be, in a position where Scotland would say, well, we actually have all those criteria, and so Scotland could pretty much be a state, and that's of course sort of it's the unilateral declaration of independence, a UDI as it's sometimes called, and that has sometimes a bad name, but many countries have actually just seceded, and then because they've met these criteria, they have been recognized as states. Kosovo is an example of that, and you have also the Baltic states seceded in the same way because they were able to had a defined territory, a defined population, were able to perform the functions of a state, and literally the rest is history. So the international law of becoming a state is relatively straightforward. I wouldn't say it's easy. And some people will notice that the book is called I Want to Break Free, and that's sort of like the Freddie Mercury reference. And I used to sort of give a talk where I talk about the Freddie Mercury theory of politics. I want to break free, and I sort of toyed with the Neil Sedaka version. Breaking up is hard to do. And I thought, in the end, my publisher said, but actually, the book argues that it isn't that hard to do. The original title was actually Breaking Up is Hard to Do, and we realized breaking up wasn't quite so hard to do. And hence it became the Freddie Mercury title rather than Neil Sedaka one.
No, that's really interesting. You said 9 years, I think, between when Malta was promised a new future within the United Kingdom and then when it voted for independence. Well, we're about 9 years now. If we're talking 2014, the referendum vote, in 2023 now. So I'm definitely going to pick up on the timing there.
Yes.
So what's your advice to the SNP / the Scottish independence movement at the moment? Because we've got this big conference happening in March in Edinburgh, and we're starting to plan the next steps for independence. What would your short piece of advice be for the independence movement?
My short piece of advice for the independence movement is to be a bit more populist about it, frankly. Get a little bit more emotion into it. We're in a nice little Scottish audience here, and we can quote one of the greatest Scottish people ever, David Hume, who says, "Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions." Now, you need to have way more passion in Scotland and less reason. There has to be, I think there is a Scottish phrase to put a kilt around things. I seem to recall from when I was in Aberdeen. And I think it has to be much more the sort of the emotional argument. It was emotions that made Norway independent. It was emotions and feelings that created Italy. And you need to, or they need, or one needs to create that in a friendly way, passion for this. Now, independence is not going to be created by statistics and economic reports or econometric calculations and so on. That's been tried so many times, and I think the mistake that some people made in 2014 was to set out all the arguments and be very sort of emotional about it. And actually, we can compare the 2014 referendum with the 2016 referendum. Now, Brexit referendum. They, very little economic case for Brexit, but that was won by emotions, because Brexit was, basically one of those goods that, if you believed in it, I think it was one of the Conservatives in favour of it said, "I'd rather eat grass than be part of the European Union." And you have to reach that sort of stage where people are totally emotional about it, and that's what has to be rammed up. If you do that, or if they do that, the SNP, I suppose, and their allies, the Green Party, and so on, then I think they'll be able to have a much stronger case. But it has to be an argument based primarily on emotion and less on reason and more on passion, if you like.
Well, let's see if the movement follows that advice. There was a lot of countries in Europe, I think around about 20 countries in Europe in the 1990s became independent, and I just kind of wanted to look at the difference now. So, if you're looking to create a new state in the 2020s, it's kind of post-pandemic, we're facing the monumental challenge of climate change and the potentially seismic impact of new technologies, not just on the workplace, but on safety and security. How different is it now when we're looking to create a new state to maybe those slightly what seemed easier times in the 1990s?
Well, I think the 1990s was quite exceptional because we had the breakdown or the meltdown really of the Soviet Union, and that released all the pressure where oppressed nations that had wanted statehood suddenly were able to pursue that. And it's another thing I talk about in the book, so the international climate. You need to, there has to be a window of opportunity, and there was very much a window of opportunity in the 1990s. There's also about finding allies that will support you. When you talk about the social media and those sort of issues, they paradoxically probably make it easier to start a movement because you can target the people. You can, the most valuable thing today is not gold or bitcoins, the latter certainly not, but it's data, and you're able to get data, and you're able to target the particular demographics that could be open to persuasion. So from a social media point of view, from a sort of environment in which we live, it is easier to target your audience if you're starting a movement these days than you have done before. Now, the problem, I think, and I don't want to be sort of critical, this is not my battle. I don't live in Scotland at the moment, so I'm speaking as if you like, an observer, neutral observer from the outside. But if I were to offer a bit of advice to the Scottish people who are in favour of independence, then it would be to learn from a lot of people that you may not like, but a lot of the populists have been very successful in using and sometimes abusing social media to get their message out, and sometimes you have to learn the tricks from your enemies. It's interesting that the Palestinian terrorist movements in the 1960s were using a little handbook that was prepared by the Jewish freedom fighters in the Mandate times, not because they liked them, but because they knew that they worked. And far be it from me to suggest that independence, people in favour of independence in Scotland are terrorists, or even the people who are Brexit people and Trump people are violent. The latter, I suppose, you could argue. But what is really important is that you use those social medias and that you're willing to probably be to get your hands a little bit dirty. And I don't like to say this. I'm just noticing what has worked in the past, and sometimes you have to pull a fast one, and you can probably do that with social media. But if you want to be sort of very nice about it and want to be sort of gentleman-like, then you end up like the samurais who were fighting the Chinese, and they insisted on bowing before them, and the Chinese just slaughtered them. So you have to be a little bit tough if you want to use the social media. That's not a thing that they can say. They will have to deny that because they're politicians. But behind the scenes, you win battle by taking the gloves off.
The narrative over the last couple of years has been that we have to be much nicer and more considerate and more understanding in social media. And you're saying that that's all nice, but probably leads to defeat rather than victory. Those other big things that we've got to consider when you're a new state. You're looking at social media as a way to drive the awareness and create a body of people who support your belief. But do you think that these huge challenges are beneficial for the arguments to create a new state? For example, how do we target climate change? How do we engage in international organisations that have to start to manage how companies and how governments are using and controlling data for security and cyber security and all of these issues? Do you think these arguments are weakened when you talk about being a smaller, more independent state? Is that a more powerful argument for a smaller, more nimble state?
Well, I think some of the most successful countries in the world in terms of GDP per capita are pretty small. I've mentioned Norway before. I could mention Switzerland. I could mention probably Belgium, Austria, Denmark, Sweden. Most of these countries are roughly the size of Scotland, and they have pretty good tech industries. They're part of international organizations. They can speak up with an independent voice. Sometimes they're punching above their weight. Like Norway has been involved in a number of international agreements and sort of spearheaded them, because Norway has been not powerful enough, but has been bold enough and frankly ballsy enough to speak up. Even in the company of large organisations. Remember, Norway is not even part of the EU, so they've been in a position where they feel they can speak freely. Now they can be part of, and they are part of, like organisations like NATO, and they have a bigger voice than you probably expect in international fora, because they are an independent state. So being an independent state does not mean that all these challenges, of course, are international challenges. Climate change requires an international solution, but it probably also requires many voices to add to that debate, and an extra state or two will just enlighten that particular debate and not diminish that. There used to be a slogan by the SNP, which was an independent Scotland in a united Europe. Now, whether united Europe or not is going to happen is questionable, but certainly in a more globalized world, you can have an independent Scotland. So I think one could probably coin the phrase of glocalism. You can you can be local in some issues, and you could be global in other issues. And that's one of the things that Scotland can do. Of course, independence is not the only option. Status quo may not be an option, but one could also perhaps think outside the box. I mentioned the Faroe Islands before. The Faroe Islands is a devolved territory in the Kingdom of Denmark. The Faroe Islands is not part of the EU, nor is Greenland. You could imagine a situation, if you didn't want to go for complete independence, and you can then go for Scotland as member of the EU in the way that Denmark is part of the EU, whereas the Faroe Islands is not. I'm not saying that's an alternative to independence, but that's one of the options. I think we also need to consider many of the other options that could be on the table, and we shouldn't sort of close ourselves to various opportunities and options. But I think if independence is what you want, then there is nothing that suggests that smaller states can't speak up. I think we're very pleased that we have some of the smaller states now who have their own points of view and are able to express them, and also express concerns that wouldn't be expressed if there were only amalgams of different people in large multi-ethnic states.
We understand the importance of government to set, as best they can, the role engagement of other institutions that are used when you're creating a state, the role of the market, regulatory bodies, trade unions, etc. Mariana Mazzucato, in her latest book, Mission Economy, discusses the potential for any state to redeploy the nation's resources to focus on missions and outcomes rather than be bound by short-term targets or kind of constrained arbitrary financial rules. How do you think the general direction given by government in a new state is important?
I think it's important that they have a narrative, and I have a whole section in my book about the Constitution, which is like the birth certificate of a new nation. And it's interesting when it's not just new states, but also countries when they have a fresh start, and then they sort of draw up, if you like, a vision statement. And I think very much this is sort of like the vision statement part of it. So I think part of creating a new state is creating these institutions. And I mean institutions in the broadest sense of the word. You know, these are the things that we're going to aspire to do. This is our mission when we start out. And it's that sort of the mission statement part of it, and the institutions that then go along with that to create that.
Yeah, and that's one of the concerns that we have with the movement, and certainly the SNP government at the moment, is it's talking about a new state along the lines of, you know, we will have to have 3% GDP to debt ratio. We can't have more than 100% of our, there's these kind of constraining financial, rather than saying our independent state will be, and then putting that vision forward, and what missions can we want to solve.
All these type of really, really unimportant sort of things. Of course, it's important, but that's what you have accountants for. That's what you got people with MBAs and stuff for that, but not for ordinary people. Ordinary people are interested in the big picture kind of thing. They're interested in the stories. And if the S&P just keeps talking about debt ratio and all of that sort of stuff, it is never, ever going to achieve independence. They might be able to appeal to certain voters in Elgin and I don't know, Paisley or wherever people are in favour of independence, and they will vote for SNP candidates in elections. But independence is not going to happen by drawing up these sort of spreadsheet approach. You need passion, not spreadsheets. And passions can be summed up in constitutional documents if they are poetic. You need to have you campaign in poetry, and then you may later on start governing in prose. But that's for a later day.
Two areas that we really find us being bogged down on when we speak about a successful economy. The first one is this idea of monetary sovereignty and currency. And the second one is this idea of borders and trade unions and single markets and stuff. So the first one, when we're looking at successful states, what role does this idea of monetary sovereignty and your own currency have, and how important is that?
Well, monetary sovereignty is one of those things that is, you are interdependent in those sort of matters. I think the Norwegian central bank changed the interest rate. I think it was 12 minutes after the European Central Bank, and the Swedes and the Danes and then they were much the same. So whether you have your own currency or not, you will always be tied to the larger one that is in the vicinity or elsewhere. The idea that you need to have your own currency to become an independent state is I think a bit of a myth. Of course, Scotland can always use the pound. The problem, however, of using the current pound is that you won't be able to use sort of monetary policy as in times of recession, and you will, in that sense, you will be at the mercy of the government from whence you have seceded. But I think there are many ways in which that can be done. You could then, you can have a currency that's pegged to another currency. The Hong Kong dollar, for example, follows the US dollar. It's not worth the same, but it sort of follows it in that way. And America and the US dollar is a pretty good one to follow. Now, Scotland would probably be doing most of its trade with Europe, so there might be a Scottish pound or whatever the unit currency would be is probably open, but it might be pegged to either the pound or to the euro. And that's sort of a small thing. It doesn't, there are all sorts of ways in which you can do that. Currency unions come and go. The Belgians, the Swiss, and the French, and the Luxembourgeois, I guess they're called, all used the franc. And then that was basically a French currency, hence the name. The Swiss are still using it, but that also fell to pieces. In the Scandinavian countries, they used the krona that used to be the same currency, and the Swedes dropped out in the 1930s. They used to have the thaler in Germany and some of the northern states. Thaler then became dollar later because we couldn't quite translate that. But the history is littered with broken currency unions, and the world has moved on pretty easily and without much of a friction. In spite of that, I think the more important thing we need to talk about is, I don't know if it's more important, but one of the things I'd like to stress is and a thing that people often say to me when I'm involved in these things and being asked about is like, but can we afford it? Wouldn't our debt be too great for us to be able to succeed? And actually, that's one of the things. There's no legal obligation to service the debt, the joint debt. You literally can walk away from the debt of the country from which you secede. Now, whether you should do that is an open question. I'm saying you here in the more sort of general sense. Ukraine, when they seceded from the Soviet Union, refused to pay any debt to the Soviet Union, and as a result, the international banks wouldn't lend money to Ukraine. Ukraine then decided to pay a little bit of the debt that the Soviet Union owed banks. But in many other cases, the countries have completely walked away. When Belgium, almost 200 years ago, became an independent state, they refused flatly to pay anything to the Dutch, and they didn't, and they still had a pretty good credit rating and were able to develop an industry. So Scotland could probably walk away from the debt, certainly legally speaking, could walk away from the UK debt, and maybe that will be you start with a clean slate.
We have a very slightly different perspective on debt and also on the importance of currency, but it was really interesting to hear your views. And then the final thing is,
and of course, these are not sort of like just. I'm not saying that these are my views as such. I mean, the debt is, and as I hope I was trying to say there, legally speaking, you don't. I mean, there was a treaty that never came into force about debt. So you can walk away from the debt, legally speaking. But there are a lot of things you can do, legally speaking, that politically aren't a good idea. And also when it comes to the currency union, what I'm laying out in my book is not how people must do it. I'm laying out a menu of things that you can do. So there are a menu of, you can keep the pound, you can have an independent central bank. All of these things are possibilities, but I think it's almost a definition of political analysis. It's a business of trade-offs, and sometimes there are more than two trade-offs. You just have to figure out, in sort of economic terms, where the equilibrium lies, and I'm providing people with the opportunity to decide from a number of options how they go for that. And indeed, if they want to have an independent state, because it may not be as I think I say somewhere in the book, if you want to have a relatively quiet life and you want to have an easy life, then you pick up learning the saxophone, learn Mandarin, or quantum physics, or sort of like easy things like that. But if you want to create an independent country, then you really have to get your act together, because that requires a lot of focus.
Absolutely. And what I promise you I will do, I'll go through that chapter in detail, and I'll look at it from a kind of heterodox perspective. The final thing I did want to ask you was about unions in Scotland as part of a European single market, and possibly potentially part of a European Union. So when you're looking at a new state, how important do you think these wider, not just economic, and the European Union is a social project as much as an economic project. How important do you think those are when creating a new state, a new small European state?
Well, it's always important not just to be part of a union like the EU. Scotland could legally be part of the EU today. I mean, Faroe Islands is not part of it. Denmark is part of the EU. then why couldn't Scotland be? I mean, so that doesn't require independence, legally speaking, from an international law point of view. What is important, what is absolutely crucially important for when you become an independent state, is to have friends in high places. You need to. I'm currently involved in Bougainville, which is voted for independence from Papua New Guinea, and it's like a tropical paradise where they had a war, and there were, the referendum was supervised actually by Bertie Ahern from former Taoiseach in Ireland. And one of the things they're looking at there is to, how do they find their way? Who are the friends going to be? And what is perhaps, it's important that you have access to markets. And the Bougainvillians would then like to see if they can get access to the Australian market, New Zealand's market, and so on. And you need to trade with people. You need to be able to. You need to have customers in the shop in order to set up shop. But what is more important is that you're allowed to trade, and you have. I know this metaphor is getting a bit worn out, but what you really, really need to do is that you need to get. You need to have people who will, if you like, protect you from those who do not want you to succeed. When Quebec was toying with or very close to becoming an independent state, they didn't just focus on the referendum. They also had a delegation that went and lobbied Bill Clinton, who was the US president at the time, and lobbied the French government, lobbied the British government in order to get support on the international scene. So while you don't need to be recognized, recognition is one of these things that's not really that important. But what is really important is that you have friends in high places. Norway became independent only when they teamed up with the British. Norway actually wanted to be a republic. And Christian Michelsen from Bergen, who was the leader of the Norwegian independence movement, wanted a republic. The British said, we're happy to support you in international fora and so on, but you need to have a constitutional monarchy. And the Norwegians say, okay, then there was a spare prince in Denmark. They got him to Norway, taught him Norwegian, and he then became the king of Norway, and Norway became independent. But that also, having said that, I think the Norwegians have this word, you have to swallow camels. And in this case, they had to swallow camels. That is, you have to be a bit flexible, and if you want independence, you can't always get everything that you want. And without being flexible, it's also very difficult.
Well, that's a wonderful way to finish. I'm going to slightly adapt your phrase when you said passion, not spreadsheets, because I'm a fan of alliteration, and I think passion, not PowerPoint, I think is what I'm going to put with that, because I think that is really, really.
If you want me to say that, I can say that.
I'll take credit for amending that a little with the alliteration. But I do think it's really important, and as an economics podcast, we cover economics because that's important for a new state. But all these other issues you've covered for us today are equally important. The support from other organisations, other institutions, other countries, I think has really come through from what you've said for us. This idea of cultural awareness and recognising who you are and your need for friends and partnership. And I think probably how you ended there with this awareness of compromise, I think is really important, because when you are small, one thing you have to do, as everybody knows throughout the life, is compromise. And I really think that we do have to think about the areas that we have to compromise on if we do in fact create a new state. Matt, thank you very much for your time. I hope the book does well. I look forward to getting my copy and properly analysing that last section. Really enjoyed the conversation with you. Thanks very much, Matt.
Thank you very much.